If you remember last week in our Easter journey, we walked alongside 3 different people that had experienced the risen Christ, and one of those people that we walked alongside of was Thomas. And I've been thinking a lot about Thomas this week, and just if you'll remember, he just came honestly and said, if I don't have this personal encounter with the risen Lord, if I don't put my fingers in his side, if I don't see that for myself, then I don't think that I can believe. And he was, obviously excited about his friend's experience. He could see the change in them, but he said, I need my own encounter. And Jesus showed up. He gave him the encounter that he wanted. In fact, the very specific encounter that he asked for. He said, here I am, and here's my wounds. Take your finger, stick it in the side, and gave Thomas exactly what he wanted, or exactly what he needed. That stuck with me this week, and I wanted to just explore with you a little bit more this week. What does this honesty before God, what does coming before God honestly and humbly do for our experience of God? How does it shape our beliefs, this coming before honestly and looking for an encounter? And so I spent some time looking at different stories of people who encountered Jesus, and I have a story that I want to talk with you about, but I need to set it up a little bit. We need to talk about the context before we get straight into it. So this is, we're going to start in John chapter 7 and deal with John chapter 7 and chapter 8. So our story starts at the Feast of Booths, and this is one of the big ones. This is one of the major feasts and festivals of the Jewish culture there, and so a lot of people there, a lot of buzz going around. People starting to talk about who this Jesus guy might be and whether he's good for Israel or whether he's bad for Israel. And some people are on one side, some people are on the other, and Jesus is just kind of laying low. He's not really saying much. But then the middle of the week comes along, and he decides that he's gonna start kind of making a public appearance. And so he shows up to the temple and he starts to teaching people. And it doesn't really say what exactly he was teaching, but it said that the people there, some of them began to marvel at him. And this just sparks this debate about who is this Jesus guy? And is he the Messiah? Is he not the Messiah? Is he good for us? Is he not good for us? And so you have this debate forming, and on one side you have the Pharisees. These are the people that tend to be seen as the bad guys in these stories. But before we just dismiss these guys as the bad guys, I wanted to maybe just explore their point of view for a minute. Maybe if we can walk a mile in their shoes. So if we go back in Israel's history a little bit, maybe like to the height of Israel, maybe King David and King Solomon, things were going great. They were a major power in their area. They were, their economy was going really great. Everybody, it was just a good time to be in that kingdom. And so time goes on, and they begin to lose their way a little bit. And what caused it was that the people and the kings lost sight of what God had said to them. They lost sight of the law, and they began to indulge in idolatry and all sorts of terrible practices. And eventually the kingdom split into 2 kingdoms, and one of those kingdoms was completely destroyed, and the other was taken into exile into Babylon. And then 70 years in exile goes by, and they They finally get released from Babylon. They come back and they get another temple and another kind of shot at this kingdom thing, and the religion and the culture that is developed out of that is one that's legalistic, because they don't want to go back to Babylon. They are tired of being small. They want the glory days back, and so they are trying to learn their lesson. They're trying to say, no, if we follow these laws, then we will be blessed again, and we will rise to prominence again. And so, these Pharisees, I think they get a little bit of a raw deal. I mean, yes, they're legalistic, and yes, there's power issues, and there's some corruption issues there. But if you can get at their heart, they just want their country back, their culture back, their prominence back. And so it's easy to see how they slip into judgmentalism and legalism. And so this is one side of the debate. The other side of the debate is Jesus and his followers saying, no, God's doing something different. God's doing something new, and I'm coming to offer this new thing to you guys. And so we're gonna catch up with some of this debate as we sit here, and we're gonna read in John chapter 7, starting in verse 25. It says, some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, is not this the man whom they seek to kill? And here he is speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ? But we know where this man comes from, and when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from. So Jesus proclaimed as he taught in the temple, you know me, and you know where I come from, but have I not come on my own accord? He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me. So they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him, because his hour had not yet come. Yet many of the people believed in him. They said, when the Christ appears, will he not do more signs than this man has done? And the Pharisees heard the crowd muttering these things about him, and the chief priests and the Pharisees sent officers to arrest him. So you can see like this debate kind of going back and forth whether, what to do with him. And then Jesus drops this kind of theological bomb. He says in verse 37, it says, on the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scriptures have said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. And so he's making these claims about himself. And the Pharisees, they're saying, you can't be saying these things. You can't be saying these things. And so they sent some people out to arrest him. And it just escalates from there. So the guys that the Pharisees sent to arrest Jesus, they show up and they hear what Jesus is saying, and they're convinced. So they go back to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees are like, hey, where's the guy we sent you to arrest? And they said, well, nobody talks like this guy. This guy might be the real deal. And that really ticks the Pharisees off. And they call the crowd uneducated and accursed. And then Nicodemus pipes up. Yes, that Nicodemus. And he says, guys, our law doesn't allow us to judge a man before we listen to him. So that didn't sit well with them either. So they shut Nicodemus down, and they're going after Jesus. And Jesus then says that he's the light of the world. And they say, well, you don't have any witness to this, so your testimony is invalid. And Jesus says, my testimony is valid because I know where I'm coming from. And if you need a witness, God is my witness. And so you see things spiraling over and over again. So Jesus says, if anybody abides in me and in my words, then he'll know the truth, and the truth will set him free. Pharisees say, we're children of Abraham. We're not slaves to anybody. Jesus says, well, if you sin, you're a slave to sin. And they say, no, we're children of Abraham. Jesus says, well, if you were children of Abraham, you would do what Abraham did. But instead, you're trying to kill me. So the Pharisees say, well, fine, we're children of God. God's our father. And Jesus says, well, if God was your father, you would love me because God sent me. And no, actually, your father's the devil. And they said, you know what? You have a demon. Jesus says, I don't have a demon. I honor God, and you're dishonoring me, who was sent from God. So you're dishonoring God. Furthermore, Jesus says, if you follow me, you won't taste death. The Pharisees say, well, what, are you better than Abraham? You greater than Abraham? Jesus says, well, Abraham would rejoice to see my day. Abraham rejoices to see my day. And they say, you're not even 50 years old, and you're talking about Abraham seeing you. And then Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Now, that is a theological conversation stopper, because it's using the same language that God used with Moses, from the burning bush. He says, when Moses asked him his name, he says, my name is I am that I am. That's what Jesus is saying. And the Pharisees caught what he was saying. The illusion didn't go over their heads. So they did the only thing that they could do. They picked up rocks and tried to kill him. But Jesus hid himself and got away, and nobody died that day. And that's how the chapter ends. It ends with this escalating conversation about who Jesus is that ends in attempted murder. Now, if you were paying close attention and you know the book of John, you know that I skipped a story. There's a story right there in the middle of the story that I just told you in that context, of a woman caught in adultery. And our earliest manuscripts don't include this story. It was just stuck there. Maybe by John, maybe by somebody else, but it doesn't really fit the flow. So when I was reading the story this week, I asked myself this question: why is it here? I mean, why is it here? It's a great story, but why is it here in this context? In the context of this argument about who is Jesus, what does this story have to teach us? So let's walk a little bit with this woman who's caught in adultery and see what it has to say. This is John chapter 7, verse 53 through 8:11. They went each to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they may have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his fingers in the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, from now on, sin no more." What a beautiful story. What compassion. What grace. It is no wonder that this story was kept. Such a wonderful, beautiful story about Jesus and this woman who was embarrassed and ashamed and needing a higher calling. But it doesn't really answer why here. Why in this context is this story here? In this escalating debate about what to do with Jesus, it's as if someone put this story right here in the middle of it, saying, who but somebody sent from God would treat this woman this way? Who but somebody sent from God would answer the way Jesus answered, with the wisdom, with the compassion? Who but someone sent by God would prioritize this poor woman's dignity and still call her to something higher? You know, in the debates about what to do with Jesus, sometimes the encounter is the thing that puts you on one side or the other. The encounter is what shows you the truth. For this woman, at least, it wasn't the arguments that were being made. It wasn't the statements that were being made. It was the encounter with Jesus Christ that made all the difference. The encounter is the proof of who Jesus is. You know, in the beginning of this story, there's a scripture that I didn't read. It says this, is Jesus talking. He said, if anyone's will is to do the will of God, he will know whether the teaching is from God or not. What he's saying is, if you come to God humbly, honestly trying to do what is right, honestly trying to live your life according to his will, if you come to him humbly and honestly, you will know whether the teaching is from God or not. That's the miracle that God promises, that if you approach him humbly, if you approach him honestly, you will know. The proof is in the encounter. If anyone comes honestly and humbly before God, he will encounter you. And that, my friends, like Thomas, will answer all of your questions. May God bless you.